We're in the middle of a series that kind of brings up some questions. We're in a series called What Happens When? And the theme of the series is all about just this phrase. It's about managing the tension between fear and faith. We talked about culture last week, and we talked about the fact that fear and faith, the important thing about fear and faith is that fear and faith dictate actions. And really, faith is not really just a belief or a hope. Faith is something that because of faith, it dictates what we do. It's a faith does, right? And we talked about that last week. Well, fear is the same way. Fear dictates a behavior, dictates action. And so we want to talk about, well, what does it look like to live our lives, to kind of choose a path, if you will, that kind of manages these two things. It manages these two things. They're kind of always there, especially for those who are followers. The faith that we have, and we're called to, and the fear that we're experiencing. The reason I love the topic of tension is because I believe that tension, there's really power in the tension. That we naturally, right, kind of drift away from things that are tense. We naturally kind of get away from things that are too challenging. And maybe we were raised in a church where asking questions and kind of feeling that way meant that you didn't have enough faith, right? Or maybe, you shouldn't ask those kind of questions. We don't believe that. We believe that there's a path, right? Last week we talked about culture, right? That following this culture is going to create for us a proper tension that's going to bring about a greater dependency, right? A proper tension, we really do believe, brings out a greater dependence, and really a dependence on Jesus. And so for all of us, we feel like no matter what the culture, like last week, no matter what culture tells us, no matter what culture is doing to challenge our faith, blind faith is not the answer. And giving into fear, like all the cultural things, religious culture, kind of worldly culture, all those things based out of fear are not the answer either. There is a kingdom path, right? There's a path that Jesus spoke about that was a tension-filled path because that's where the power is, because that's where you and I are kind of required to have our closest walk with Him, right? That by God through His Spirit would help us walk the tension path. So again, last week, just this example of fear and faith, this proper tension in the middle, is going to create for us a greater dependence on Jesus, especially when it comes to cultural conversations. However, today, we're going to shift gears, and we're going to talk about what happens, right? Well, last week was what happens when culture challenges my faith. This week is what happens when family challenges my faith. What happens when family challenges my faith? Now, I'll give you a great example. I wrote about the blog this week. I told you in the blog that I believe my wife challenges my faith, right? She challenges my faith all the time. However, it's in the best way. I mean, it really is in the best way. We argue all the time about what the Bible says about something, and we have different, opinions and views. She's still arguing with what I preached about with last week. And so, if you ever struggle with not believing something I said, she doesn't believe me either sometimes. So, and it's not that, it's not that it's a bad thing. It's just that we both have a relationship with God, and we're both seeking what God would have for us. And it's just fun. It's fun in our household anyway. Maybe it's not fun for everybody else. It's fun for us. We love discussing it. We love that because it's, as the Bible says, as iron sharpens iron, right? We feel like it's a constant thing that sharpens our relationship, our marriage as it's centered on Christ. But here's what I know. Here's what I know to be true. I know that doesn't happen for everybody, That when we talk about, family challenging our faith, that sometimes really comes out in the form of a very combative nature. That there's a sibling or a parent that rejects what you believe, rejects how you want to live your life, gives you problems. It's constantly a conversation. They won't not bring it up because they think you're stupid. They think you're dumb for having this faith that you have. And there's a constant challenge. Sometimes it shows up in just being unsupportive, right? This is another Mother's Day where he's not here, right? Where the kids are not here because they've walked away, because they don't support what you believe. That's a really hard one as well, when kids walk away from the faith, when you've raised them in the church and kids want to have nothing to do. At a certain age, we deal with that all the time in terms of our youth. They're just done. They're going to try something else. We'll talk a little bit about that today too, but that's a tough part where it challenges our faith. Another way it shows up is that sometimes it can be two Christians in a family that completely disagree, maybe with what one person believes God's leading them to do, And the other one is just like, how would God ever tell you to do something like that? It doesn't make any sense to me at all. Why would he ever have you move? Why would he ever have you, husbands and wives, why would he ever ask you to leave or have a separation in this marriage? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And so challenge can even come from people that are both claiming faith. There can be a challenge there. I can't go through a Mother's Day and not know that, maybe this isn't true for you, but there are so many ladies that have longed to be mothers. And this is just another Mother's Day where they're not. They're not. And it could be because of complications. It could be because I remember the Mother's Day that my wife and I had to experience after our first pregnancy that was a miscarriage. After that Mother's Day before we were pregnant with Parker, that Mother's Day was, we had trouble getting pregnant before, and then to be pregnant and then to lose that baby, it was a tragic Mother's Day for us. And if you never experienced this, I'm just saying that you don't understand what a challenge that is to your faith. So there's lots of people experiencing that as well. So it's a big deal when it comes to how faith and how fear come and play a part. And when it challenges us in our families, really the people that we love most, or that are supposed to be the ones that love us most, right? It's either combative, or it's non-supported, or it's challenged in any of those negative ways. I believe there is, as we're going to talk about it today, I believe there is a path of tension. I'm not going to point at anybody over here. I'm just using this as the path. All right, just so that you know ahead of time, this is the path, right? There is a path of tension that I believe. There's lots of things that can be a part of, when family is challenging your faith. But I think there's a root, a big cause, a big thing in the middle, a big rock in the jar, so to speak, that you can deal with, that you can find freedom in, that you can experience a fullness in, no matter what the dysfunction or issue or challenge in your family might be. There is a path of tension that you can walk, and it's just summed up in one word, okay? And that word's forgiveness. Forgiveness. And forgiveness is such an easy thing. I'm done the message. We can just go and have lunch, and, that's pretty it, right? Forgiveness is such an easy thing to deal with, no problem at all. No, forgiveness is one of the more difficult things that anyone deals with, regardless of your faith, regardless of your spiritual journey. Forgiveness is not something that comes easy to anyone, really. But it's such a root issue. It's such a core decision when it comes to challenges and dysfunctions and issues in a family that we really have to look at, what does forgiveness look like? Now, if you've never heard me talk about forgiveness, I'm going to give you how I break down forgiveness, because it can be broken down in several different ways, but I want to give you just how I think about forgiveness when it comes to kind of the components of it. There is a forgiveness that's given, okay? This is from the person that's extending that forgiveness, and it really is a state of the heart, a state of the mind, where it's a blank slate. It's like, look, you don't owe me. Is a great phrase to remember. When you're extending forgiveness, when you are giving forgiveness, there is a state in which you say, you do not owe me. There is no record of wrong. You're free from the debt that I've placed on you. It's given. There is a freedom, we'll go down to granted. And what's different about freedom given versus freedom granted is freedom granted is where there's actually the person who's offended, right? The person who's broken the relationship actually takes ownership of that, actually says, I'm sorry, right? And they turn, and there's some attempt, and oftentimes granted means that not only was forgiveness given, but it was accepted, therefore it's reconciled. There's some reconciliation. And I know that gets complex. It could be, years before something's restored, but it could be reconciled just within that kind of forgiveness given versus forgiveness granted. Now, forgiveness rejected, the reason I say rejected, singularly broken, meaning it only takes one person, right? It only takes one person to maybe extend forgiveness and then take it away and not accept the person's apology. Or it could be the person that you choose to forgive, but that person just rejects it. They don't feel like they've done anything wrong to break the relationship. They don't feel like they're in the wrong. They don't feel like there's, that's just another one of your weird religious things. Like they're not going to own anything in there. So it really only takes one person to reject where forgiveness is, and it makes it very difficult for any reconciliation, any restoration. So forgiveness has a lot of these components to it. So today, I want to talk about forgiveness. If you're new to Journey, I'll just give an example. We usually give quite a bit of scripture, and there's plenty of times that the Bible talks about forgiveness. But today I'm focusing on one passage only. It's in Luke 15. If you have your Bible with you, you can turn it on your own, or your phone or tablet. Just turn to Luke 15. We're going to jump into the story, but it's just one of those times where Jesus is teaching, his disciples, the crowds, the Pharisees. Jesus is teaching, and as he's teaching, he's talking about the heart of God and how God views things, and he gives this incredible story of a family, and forgiveness is at the core of the story. So that's where we're going to kind of park today. The first two stories, I'll kind of briefly just kind of go over. He talks about a shepherd who has 100 sheep. And one of the sheep wanders off, and he leaves the 99, and he goes after the one. And when he finds the one, he comes back and calls all his shepherd's buddies. I don't know what that was like, but he texts them all, And he says, hey, I found my sheep, the sheep that was gone. And they all rejoice with him. They all party. Then he goes and talks about a woman who has 10 coins, and that culture, that was a very significant thing. It had to do with dowries and all sorts of stuff. But these 10 coins were kind of sometimes war. There's 10 coins that represented something. Well, she lost one of her coins. And it goes on to say, Jesus, as he's giving the story, she turns the house upside down, like to look for, right? That's what you do. And everybody's nodding their heads, like, yeah. They look for the lost coin. She finds the lost coin. She calls the girlfriends up. She says, come on over. Wine's on me. We're going to party. They're going to celebrate because I found the coin that was lost. And then he goes into a story of a dad and his two sons. And that's where we're going to jump in to the story. And I want to walk through this through the lens of this tension of forgiveness and how difficult this path is to walk as Jesus teaches using the story. Let's go to Luke 15. We're going to jump in at verse, I think it's 12, right? Yeah, 11. And he goes on to say this. To illustrate the point further, this is him, illustrate the point further. Jesus tells them another story. A man had two sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now before you die. So the father, what's the word there? Agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. Now, there's a couple things I have to point out at the beginning of the story, just so you can have it in your mind before we get going too far. The first thing I want you to see is that this story, he drops us into a story where the relationship is already broken. Okay? The relationship is already broken. Sometimes people can read the story quickly and think, oh, that was a dumb move by the son. That was a point of tension that caused the problem kind of thing. But the reality is that in there, Jesus is teaching about a very cultural thing. And the reality is if you get to this point in the story and say, look, the younger son says, give it to me now. And the father agrees, this would have been unheard of in their culture. It would have been unheard of. So just kind of going back, you have to understand that this is kind of the straw that breaks the back. Does that make sense? The straw that breaks the camel's back. This is the result of an already broken relationship between a father and his son. So this is where we get dropped in to the story. And forgiveness is going to take root right here at the very beginning. Now, I want to walk very quickly through, again, the fear and faith. Why is it that we struggle to forgive? Well, fear tells us that we struggle to forgive because we don't want to have the personal rejection. Okay? In terms of, and people can say, well, some things aren't personal. No, everything's personal. If you're people, it's personal, right? That's how it works, right? So everything's personal. Personal rejection is that I'm going to take it personally. It's going to hurt me. If I try to forgive and it's rejected and it's not received and not accepted, you know what I'm saying? There's a fear that drives us not forgiving. There's a fear that drives us into this state of struggling to forgive. And yet we have faith where God is telling us and asking us in all Scripture to trust Him fully with the circumstances, to trust Him fully with the outcome, to trust Him fully with our relationships, to trust Him and to trust God. And so sometimes we think it's a balancing act, kind of like a balancing thing where, well, I'm going to trust God a little with my relationships, and but fear is still pretty strong, so I'm going to work out of fear, and I'm going to work out of faith, I'm working out of fear. And it's like a balancing act. That's really not the way tension works. Tension works with the fact that you realize both are calling you to take full action, right? Fear is telling you don't do it, and faith is telling you to trust God, and you have to choose something that balances and manages both. And that's where forgiveness comes in. That's why forgiveness is such a big deal. And again, part of this, so you can see at the beginning of the story before we even see it, is forgiveness has a core here at the very beginning of the very beginning. Forgiveness, right? Forgiveness was given before the kid left. Forgiveness was given before the kid left. See, sometimes we want to jump to the end of the story. No. The beginning of the story matters. Why? Because again, culturally, Jesus would have been telling these stories to a bunch of mostly men. There would have been some women there and kids. But, as he told the story of the shepherd, they all would have went, yeah, that's true. And as he told the story about the woman and the coin, they all would have been like, yeah, that's right. They would have been nodding their heads and agreeing, right? And then when he went to the story of the sons, by the second sentence, right? By the second sentence, hey, there's these two kids. The younger one says, give it to me now. And it says the father agreed to do it. Everyone in the crowd would have went, no. Because by their cultural right, not only could the father have just simply kicked the kid out at that moment, disowned him, really. They had actual corporate punishment in place for children that did these kind of things to parents. I don't know what would have fully, I can't really give you the fullness, but the reality is this is not something that had to be done at all. This was one of those things that even in the moment, people would have been like, that doesn't make any sense at all. Well, it doesn't make any sense because the reality is, he says that he agrees. Because again, we walk into a broken relationship already, and he agrees. He says yes to giving his son half the wealth that he'd already attained, to let him go. And forgiveness started in that moment. It didn't happen later on. It started then. It started with the father giving his love, giving his forgiveness in that moment when he even agreed to let him go. So, we'll keep moving with the story. A few days later, this is verse 13, a few days later, this younger son packed up all his belongings and moved to a distant land where he, what's the word? Wasted. You can talk out loud in church. It's okay. I'm going to say it one more time. He moved to a distant land, and there where he, what's the word? Wasted all his money and wild living. We find out a little bit more about the wild living later. It says, as the time came, his money ran out, and a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. Again, culturally, as Jesus taught this, all the men, all the people listening to this would have been a very significant, disgust reflex. Does that make sense? They would have been disgusted as the story went on. Think of the most disgusting thing you can think of right now. Right? That's the feeling they would have had in this moment of the story. Disgust. And he goes on to say, the young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him. But, read this last sentence with me, no one gave him anything. Now, I got to stop here and mention something, because it's another point of tension, and it ties to forgiveness, but just, I want you to see how it pieces together. I want you to see here that I don't ever want you to underestimate the power, right, the tension, the power and the tension of a freedom fail. Never underestimate the power that comes from the tension of a freedom fail. Okay? A freedom fail moment, if you haven't had one, you're not old enough, right? Or you're lying. That's just the way it works, right? A freedom fail is when you decide, regardless of wisdom, regardless of what your parents said, regardless of what your friends said, regardless of what your spouse said, regardless of what wisdom told you, you decided to take your own path, your own route. If I could just get away from these rules, if I could just get away from this person, if I could just get out of this system, I'm going to be happy. And you know what? For a moment, it's usually pretty awesome because that's just the way it works. You do find some happiness, but there's always a fail at the end. There's always something, the bottom drops out. There's always something that's completely unfulfilled. And a freedom fail is a moment that God uses. So don't underestimate. This is hard. I'm just telling you this is very difficult. It's very difficult when I have conversations with folks whose spouse has walked away, and to a certain degree, they're struggling to forgive, and knowing that forgiveness that starts there has to let them go. Paul would address it, right? Paul addresses it in the church in Corinth. He writes about this guy in the church, and this guy in the church is doing some pretty nasty stuff with I can't even get into it. He's doing some nasty, he's doing stuff that even the pagans go, gross, right? So it's not just the church. It wasn't just a religious thing. Even the pagans, even the heathens think it's gross. And he goes on to say, look, just turn him over. Just let him go. You know what I'm saying? Don't try to figure out how to make him part of your life group. Just let him go, right? Just let him go and live that freedom fail. You don't know what God's going to do. But I can tell you what, it's really hard for parents. And I haven't personally experienced this fully yet, but I watched it with my mom and dad. with my brother. It's very hard to watch your kids reject and rebel and reject and rebel and watch them go experience pain and see the bottom drop out. But you don't know what God's going to do in that moment. You don't, again, what's faith? Trust God with all of that. So don't underestimate what happens in a freedom fail. This is what happens to this guy. His father lets him go. That's where forgiveness starts. But he has a freedom fail moment. And then, this is where we follow in the story, it says, when he finally came to his senses. Now, finally, I have no idea how long finally is, right? Finally could be months. Finally could be, I've talked to some adult men that are still working through finally. Finally is years sometimes, right? Finally came to his senses. And he said to himself, at home, the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. Like all the servants at home have leftovers. And he says, I'll go home to my father and say, because this is how it works, right? I can hear my kids practicing the speech upstairs before they come downstairs, right? This is the canned speech, right? Everybody has this. If you're a parent, you know. I will go home and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son, which is true. And says, please take me on as one of your hired servants. So he returned home to his father. He comes home. And I love this verse. It says, and while he was still a long way off, while he was still just a speck in the distance, his father saw him coming. Filled with, what's the two words? Love and compassion. He ran to his son. He embraced him. And he kissed him. Now this is, I'll be honest, this is how you know that forgiveness has been given. That you have fought the hard fight of tension to forgive, even at the very beginning. Is when there's a little bit of a turn, when there's a little bit of a change of heart, when there's a little bit of a coming to the senses that your heart is filled with love and compassion. Now I know, listen, this is just part of the scenario. This is where, again, this is the tension. In order to see forgiveness granted, right, it must be given and accepted. This is hard because there's a lot of people of faith. There's a lot of people of faith that kind of know that forgiveness is what they're supposed to do. They pray the Lord's Prayer, forgive those as we forgive them, and they know it up here, but the reality is that they have forgiven so little. They've forgiven so little, and they know that even when there's a turn, when there's a freedom fail, when something happens, there's almost a justification in their heart, right? There's almost a justification. Yeah, he left or she left and she thought and look at them fail. And there's almost like, this is how evil our hearts are. There's almost a little bit of justification that comes up like, I knew that would happen. Adult parents with adult children, this is going to happen here too. I have warned them and I have told them and I have told them and I've seen the future and I know, this kid is me and I've warned them and told them, right? And here they go. And if we're not careful, it's pretty clear to us that forgiveness, there's been no real forgiveness there. Because it really, once they make that turn, once that I'm sorry comes, it has to be accepted, right? It has to be accepted. And listen, I've had people tell me all the time, oh, Matt, you don't understand. I get it, I understand, but you don't understand what they did to me, right? You don't understand how many times they said I'm sorry and nothing's changed. Welcome to the world of counseling that we deal with all the time. You don't understand. And listen, just understand, I know there's exceptions. Look, I know there's exceptions. I know there's physical abuse issues. I know there's emotional abuse. I know there's things that could take years of counseling and things to see reconciliation happen or to see restoration happen. But listen, I'm just trying to tell you that you'll know whether forgiveness really is at the root and the core, that you've chose the path of tension, that when you see a turn, when the I'm sorry comes, if the heart is filled with love and compassion. I'll tell you briefly, I was fired from a church, which is awesome because I'm your pastor now. That's so good. I was fired from a church, and it was a brutal thing. It was a betrayal, and I was so hurt by the church, and everything that I was, at one time feared the church would do, did to me. And it was a hard thing. And I harbored, I'm talking massive bitterness and resentment towards the pastor of the church. And it was years. I'm saying years. When I say years, think years, plural, right? Multiple years. I'd choose forgiveness, but it was like an onion. It's like peel a little layers, but there's a ton of bitterness still there. And I remember my wife and I having this conversation because it was several years, maybe 5 years after this experience, that we heard from another friend that the pastor had a health issue, like a massive health problem that came up. And I remember in that moment, my heart was soft. Like, I remember in that moment, my heart was soft as in, well, that's not good. Like, I would not want that for his family. You know? Like, that's not, I was broken for that pastor. And that's how I knew that forgiveness had actually happened, in that moment. Now, 2 years earlier, I couldn't have promised that would have been the case. There might have been something in me, something really dark that would have went, that's right, he deserves it. Does that make sense? In order to see that forgiveness granted, the fullness of forgiveness granted, it has to be given and it has to be accepted. And that's where we struggle. Let's keep going with the story. The father runs out and kisses him. The son says to him, starts the speech, right? Father, I've sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father interrupts him, because you know the speech was longer, right? He says, his father said to his servants, quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. You know what that means? It meant that he was clean to the father. I mean, as filthy and disgusting as this story was, to everybody listening, the moment the father makes this choice, says, no, put the finest robe on him, was a sign of the father saying, you are clean. And he says, get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. You know what the ring was? The ring was the sign that you are my son. You will not be a servant. You're my son. And kill the calf we've been fattening. And then he goes on to say, what's the 2 words? Must celebrate, right? We must celebrate. With a feast, for the son of mine who is dead is now returned to life. He was lost, but he's found. So the party began. What a beautiful, don't miss the big picture. What a beautiful picture of the heart of God for you and for me. That's what this parable is all about. That regardless of where we have been, when we come to him, he looks at us because of Jesus and says, you're clean. You're a son and a daughter. That's who you are. We must celebrate. For this one that was lost is now found. This one who was gone is now home, brought back to life. Now, I wish, because this is a big deal. This was not just forgiveness granted. This is not just reconciliation. This was full restoration to this son. And I listen, just me. Sometimes I read this and I just go ahead and stop there, because the party started. And who doesn't want to stop when the party starts, right? Like, why keep going? Why have any more conversation? But, Jesus in his, wisdom, has more to say that has to do with this lesson of forgiveness. So he goes on to say this. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working. And when he returned home, he heard the music and dancing in the house, and he asked one of the servants, what's going on? Your brother's back, right? Your brother is back. He was told, and your father has killed the fattened calf. We are celebrating because of his safe return. And the older brother was ecstatic and so happy he couldn't wait to join the party. No, it doesn't say that. Oh, the older brother was, what's the word? Angry. And refused to go in. Refused to go in. The father came out and begged him. And he replied, all these years, I've, what's that word? Slaved for you. And I never once refused to do a single thing you told me to do. And in all that time, you never gave me, right? You never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. And he goes on to say, yet, when this son, notice the words, not my brother, when this son of yours, right, comes back after squandering his money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fatted calf. And the father said to him, look, dear son, you have always stayed by my side. You've always been with me. And everything I have is yours. Everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate. Now, I love the words there. He's just like, we have to celebrate. We must celebrate this happy day. For your brother was dead, and he's come back to life. He was lost, but he's found. And then Jesus ends the story. We don't have any idea how it resolved. There's no Disney happy ending, which I love, by the way. I love Disney happy endings, right? There's no Disney ending to this. It's just left. It's left with the predicament of, so what happened? We don't know. Jesus in his wisdom felt the need to teach the lesson about how the heart of God, this lavish heart of God, forgives and loves those, his sons, his kids, even the ones that aren't with him. But there's an older brother that doesn't understand forgiveness. There's an older brother, there's an older son who rejected it. And that's a part of the lesson we have to know. That forgiveness rejected, and there's lots of reasons that, again, there's lots of reasons forgiveness can be rejected. But here's two that show up in the story, and here's two that I feel like are powerful and they're huge in our lives. One of the two big things we see in the story of why forgiveness was rejected is, one, there was a false identity. And two, there was a faulty perspective. There was a faulty perspective. Let me tell you how this works out with us before I go back to the story. Again, kind of in the world of counseling. What happens is that when people struggle to forgive, again, everything's an exception. And everything can't be an exception. If everything's an exception, the problem is you, not the issue, right? Everything's an exception. And people who struggle to forgive, and fear is a big part of that, just rejection. And because of fear of rejection, they reject forgiveness. They reject it for themselves, and they reject it for others, to extend it to others. And because of that, because of these two things, this, I don't know who I am, there's a false identity, and there's a faulty perspective, Jesus is really, he uses very strong words about what it looks like. Okay, even in the Lord's Prayer, forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors, right? Jesus uses a lot of strong words about people who have been forgiven that refuse to forgive. They are digging a deeper grave for themselves. That's my paraphrase, right? And so in the story, we see this come to life. We know how it works for us. We see it come to life. The son says, I'm a slave. Like immediately in his words, he goes, like he doesn't understand that he's the oldest son. He's the one that was dedicated to God in their culture. He's the one, if anything happened to dad, he would run everything. He was next in line, right? He was the oldest son, the place of highest honor in a family. And he says, I'm a slave. I have slaved for you. I've never once said no. I've never once caused a problem. I never once did this. I never once did it. And you never gave me anything. That's a false identity of who he is. Because the father looks at him and says, no, you're my son. Everything I have is yours. Everything I have. There was all sorts of little goats you could have took at any time you wanted to, and I would have joined the party, right? Like, you need to remember who you are. And the faulty perspective is there because, quite honestly, remember when he said, your son versus my brother, right? Remember that? Not only did the older son not really understand how the dad saw him, he thought the dad saw him as a slave. Not only did he not understand that, he had no clue, no perspective at all of how the dad saw his brother. Which is why he had to repeat it. Look, we have to celebrate. This is the transformation from death to life. This is my son whom I love. Just as much as he loves the son, he's like, oh, this is my other son whom I love. And listen, for you and I, when forgiveness at the root is a problem, we have a hard time walking down this path, there's a good chance that you have a really confused idea as to who you are. You don't see yourself as a son and daughter of God. You don't see yourself as someone who has been forgiven a debt that was so great that you couldn't do a single thing about it. You don't see yourself, as one who has been lavished forgiveness and love on, and therefore now has the power, because I love that statement where he says, everything I have is yours. You have the power within you now to forgive everyone who has offended you, wronged you, hurt you. You have it. You don't even need to pray for him to do anything else. It's there. You just have to remember who you are. And then there's an aspect of a perspective that, quite frankly, when we struggle to forgive, like when I'm talking about marriages and parents and kids and siblings, and when you have that bitterness and anger in your heart towards someone that's supposed to be one of the closest people to you, not only have you lost sight of how, you're confused about how you view them as faulty, you have now placed that on God. You think that's how God feels about them. Right? I mean, obviously God's as upset with them as I am. Right? It's a faulty perspective. What do you think God really thinks about that spouse of yours? That kid who's rebelled and run? How do you think God feels about that parent who constantly is challenging your faith? And you're just harboring and struggling. How do you think God feels about them? That's a perspective you need to have if you want to try to walk this path of forgiveness. Is it easy? No. Here's the theme, right? Taking the path of forgiveness given and granted, right? What is it going to do? It's going to cause greater dependency on Jesus. There's no possible way for you to walk this path. There's no possible way for you to start with forgiveness, let alone forgiveness given, let alone experience what it's like to have things restored and reconciled, to have forgiveness granted on your own. This is somebody who says forgiveness is important because I'm trusting God with the outcome of this relationship. I'm trusting God fully. Oh, and fear that lies beneath the surface, that fear is always going to be there because I'm always going to be tempted to preserve my own heart and preserve my own feelings and preserve me. But in order to manage the tension between these two things, I'm going to choose the path of forgiveness. Listen, for some of you, I already know what's going on, okay? I'm not going to pick on you, but many of you have been pushing back all morning long. Yeah, but Matt, you don't know. And Matt, you don't know. You don't know. I married crazy, Matt. You don't know. I sense I can hear the silent turning of the mind. No. Or many of you are sitting there, and this is true too. Many of you are sitting there going, man, I wish they were here. Right? I wish they were here. I wish they could have heard this. I'm forwarding this message the moment it comes online, right? Because you think it's for them. But you're the one who's here. And the message is for you. God already had that worked out. The message is for you. And listen, you may be the one, in terms of things, you may be the one of lesser offense. You may be the one, maybe it's not as big of a thing for you, but you're the one that's here, and you are the one that maybe needs to cause that breakthrough. You need to choose to give forgiveness first. And constantly make that choice, so that when there is a turn, that your heart is filled with love and compassion, and not with justification, anger, and bitterness. You're the one here. You're the one being challenged. That regardless of what the dysfunction is, regardless of what the issue is, regardless of what I can't even imagine the complexity, right, that is in this room in terms of family dynamics. I can tell you that if you have a hope in your life to live free and experience the fullness of what family could be and mean for you, then you're going to have to deal with your heart of forgiveness at some point. You have to. Because there's no way these challenges are going to come up and you're going to walk to the other side without forgiveness. And it starts with you. It starts with me. Let's pray together. Father God, we're so thankful for today, and I'm thankful for just the way you challenge us. This story that Jesus shared is so powerful. And yet, God, for all of us, I speak for me and everyone else in the room, forgiveness is so, it's not just not easy. It's so contrary to everything that we feel. And so it's beyond intentional, God, for us to make the choice to forgive. It is something that you have to not only lead us to do, but then infuse us with power to do it. And yet, God, I'm so thankful that you said that we are your sons and daughters. We are the children of God. And everything that you have is ours already. We're not having to wait for more faith in order to do it. You've given us this faith to live now. And we can do it now. That God, for those watching in Denver and those watching later, and for maybe those that are struggling with this, that you're going to place this message in their hands. God, I pray that you would just move through your Spirit in a powerful way to their unique circumstances. Let them hear what you want them to hear, and then take action. Okay, take a step towards forgiveness. Not only do you help us take the step, God, but you promised if we take the step, you will be there and meet us as well. As that song said, there's not a single moment that you're going to forsake us. If we walk this path, this tension-filled path of forgiveness. God, it's only by your power, it's only by your grace that we can see these things transform our lives. And we pray all this, that it would do so in your name, Jesus. Amen.